Yes. So my name is Teresa Gerbig. I'm the Pharmacy Network Manager for RxE2, and I'm very pleased to be able to bring you this webinar here on DCT trials or decentralized trials and the DCT evolution and empowering clinical research through community pharmacy. Um, Very pleased to introduce our featured guest, Craig Lipsick. Craig, thanks so much for joining us here today. We're so thrilled to have you here. Just a little bit about Craig. Um, Craig is a co-founder and co-chair of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, a global nonprofit organization dedicated to the adoption of more accessible clinical research participation. He also serves as vice president of innovation for the Buffalo Initiative, a nonprofit patient-led platform for the development of new treatments in neglected rare diseases. He is adjunct assistant professor in health informatics at Rutgers University and an adjunct instructor at the University of Rochester Center for Health and Technology. Craig serves on the board of directors as vice president for the Foundation of Sarcoidosis Research, as well as on the editorial board of for therapeutic innovation and regulatory science. He's an external advisor to Every Cure, IMI Trials at Home, HL7 Project Vulcan, and the Duke iCubed Innovation Center. As managing partner of Clinical Innovation Partners, Craig is an advisor to technology and biopharmaceutical companies, leading universities, and the venture community seeking to develop and implement innovative solutions for clinical research. He serves on the board of directors for Circuit Clinical, Empath Labs, and MedVector. For nearly a decade, Craig was a head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, leading digital initiatives, patient engagement, and collaborations across all therapeutic areas around the globe. Wow, Craig, that's quite a list of accomplishments. We're lucky to have you here. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Gerald Finken. Gerald is RxE2's CEO and founder. He has over 40 years of experience in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical industries. He's also a licensed pharmacist. He founded RxE2 to bring the practice of pharmacy to clinical trials and committed to making clinical trials a viable healthcare option for everyone, everywhere. Gerald, Craig, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Teresa. Really appreciate that. The way Craig and I set this up is we're going to learn from Craig today. Because one thing I didn't hear in that bio is father of virtual DCTs. There's nobody that has the expertise and knowledge on this subject matter. And so I'm just thrilled to be sitting down with you today.
Well,
And
I'm
having a
thrilled to be
conversation.
sitting with the father of pharmacies in clinical research. So
Very good.
it's really my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to learning together with you and many that you have here in the community gathering.
Great. So let's get started into this conversation. And it's interesting because I think we go in so many ways. So, but first, what I'd like to do is in looking at the audience, again, this presentation was really first opened up to pharmacists involved in clinical trials that we're working with, as well as others say, listen, if you're a pharmacist, you want to learn more about clinical trials, again, from the community setting or the retail setting, et cetera, here's a conference to come on and begin the learning. So, of course, the knowledge there, as healthcare professional experts with drugs, the knowledge on DCTs might be a little bit less. And I know we have some other very experienced DCT personnel on the line. So can I first ask you maybe to level set this conversation for everybody and see if you could bring the two sides together to.
Absolutely. For folks that aren't steeped in clinical trials and clinical research every day, I often just think about this as inputs and outputs. A clinical research drug development program really has, I guess, three inputs. There's an investigational medicine, a human participant in the study, together with their data. And these inputs we combine to create the outputs that matter, our evidence around efficacy and safety for those, in the case of where I tend to work, those investigational new medicines. And so when we think about the challenges that continue to stress this industry and why is drug development hard and why is it expensive, The medicines themselves, there's a robust pipeline of, and there's processes for their discovery and licensing. And in fact, we tend to have more medicines in the pipeline than we have capacity to develop. And so think about those other two inputs, the people and their data. Are we able to find and engage, activate, and enroll participants for these studies? And that's this big patient recruitment challenge and access challenge we often talk about. And can we manage and collect the data that we need to in reliable and robust and compliant ways in order for us to understand those outputs, our measures of efficacy and safety? And those latter two are the two that tend to stress this industry the most and tend to be the areas we most frequently point to as why drug development is hard, why drug development is delayed. Access to patients and confidence in how we're collecting our data. Now, confidence in collecting our data is a dynamic challenge, in part because we're always adding new ways that we could try to generate data in our studies. Once upon a time, it was all case report forms on triplicate paper, and we would have a patient come to the clinic and we'd fill out forms. But today there are so many concomitant sources of data that we're engaging with. Electronic health records, connected devices, and wearable sensors, a range of both established and exploratory wet measures and biomarkers we may be exploring, along with patient-reported measures, different types of patient-reported outcomes. And so it makes sense that we continue to stress about how we're collecting and capturing data because that universe keeps expanding. Meanwhile, we continue to stress about patient recruitment and representation. And it's not like that universe is expanding. Why is it that we're still so bad at this? Why is it still so hard for us to find the patients that we're looking to enroll, to engage them in research, and to be able to welcome them in our studies in ways that actually represent the underlying population that will ultimately be exposed to that medicine, assuming it actually reaches the market and gets approved? And it's interesting that that continues to vex us and challenge us, even though there's all these digital innovations out there in the environment. We can point to access to electronic health records and using AI to try to mine and scrape through that data to try to improve our ability to match patients who might be eligible. So with all of that innovation, why is it still so hard for us? Why, if you go to a conference today, but then you went in a time machine back 20 years ago, you'd still see on the agenda how patient recruitment is still vexing this industry. And that tends to be, I think, our doorway for a lot of this conversation. How can we make research more accessible for patients in different communities who typically might have been marginalized because they just didn't have access to be able to get to that research site wherever it may be on the planet? I do a lot of work in rare diseases. We're flying families around the country, around the world, just to give their children the hope and the promise of access to an investigational medicine. This is not a sustainable, fair, and equitable model. How many families, even if you're covering the cost of travel, how many families can take that type of time off, given the devastation, the financial impact on them of many of these diagnoses? And so I think this hopefully sets up some of our conversation on why we need to think about other places and ways that people can participate in research and help us to kind of tackle some of our freakonomics, our misaligned economic incentives that sometimes stand in the way for why people aren't learning about trials just in the course of how they're receiving care.
Tremendous. Thank you, Craig. It's interesting as you very on key topics about patients' data, which is really the key to this. And I think about the founding of RxE2 and the idea of getting pharmacists involved is because of that very reason. It always got me that being in North Dakota, I always said I'd like someone in Rugby, North Dakota, to be able to participate in a clinical trial without driving 8 hours to Rochester, the Mayo Clinic, and And so to get into this, it's always, I've always looked at, again, the role of pharmacists, and I think we could play a greater role. And not that we'll talk some about that today, because today really is about decentralized clinical trials and where they are. And like I think about the topic. So like I just quickly jotted down a list. So like we could talk about regulations, quality, cost, recruitment, patient staffing, healthcare professionals, adoption, technology, the future, cager, hype cycle, all these topics.
I'm glad we've got a good 8 hours to spend
Yeah,
together with everyone.
yeah.
They
So
buckle
with
in.
all of that, yeah, with all of that, there are a couple of key places I want to like in my simple mind about how things work, and of course, the complexities you mentioned. That it does come down to some simplistic things, patients and data. And so when I think about all those topics, like where do we start? And so I'm going to kick us off, but I have a feeling we're going to get they all interact and intertwine, and and we could talk about anything else. Let's just get started. I was thinking about costs, and in my experience, in my lifetime, I'm a clinical supplies expert, and I had a company and created the on-demand concept in the industry that now everybody's using. And I'll never forget when we went out there about this concept, direct costs and indirect costs. And so I can talk about the benefits of the indirect cost, right? No waste, timelines, and yet it always came down to is what's the bottom line, the direct cost. And it's like, but wait a minute, you're never going to see that direct, but didn't matter. So to me, when I think about decentralized clinical trials, sometimes I think that like the holdback is that direct cost, the bottom line. What do you see? And when I think specifically about the cost of shipping drug to patients and the model of sending it directly to the patient's home, now you have 12 shipments at $1,200 a shipment versus one to a clinical site at $1,500. And then I think about the patient, themselves and the conduct of the study nurses and the, and the PIs getting to come to a, virtual and come to the patient's home. But I really would like to take this further because I think that's so simplistic. And there's ways I look at that. I'd like to talk about ways I think we can reduce those costs. But can you talk to the costs? Let's talk about this because I know you've done work in this, especially with Tufts and
This topic of cost is a great one, right? And I'm going to kind of bundle cost and burden together as well, because
nice.
burden to study teams, burden to research sites have a cost that sometimes we don't quantify. But trust me, study teams are doing that math in their heads. And so while they may not come back and say there's a personal cost to me, they're sort of thinking of that in terms of burden, and they're very intertwined. And then, of course, we can think about the cost to the patients and their families themselves, both direct as well as indirect. And so this is a really complex conversation, but if we simplify it down to the dollars that people see in their budgets, right? Up front, when they're planning and designing a study, they plan for success. And so their study budget maybe includes a few dollars here and there for recruitment campaigns, and recruitment activities. And many of these other things we're talking about, say, could we have certain visits take place at less conventional locations to make them more accessible? Use of video, use of home health, use of a connected device to enable some of our data to be collected remote to the patient, use of local pharmacies as a location and touch point. All of those start to seem in terms of optics as just being additional cost. These are new line items that you want to add to my study. And so, of course, people will want to say, well, what's the return on this? The return could be around recruitment predictability, de-risking recruitment and enrollment. Is that enough? And so we have seen the data, as Gerald mentioned, start to get published through groups like Tufts and the Center for the Study of Drug Development, as well as other groups looking to quantify the ROI of using these decentralized elements. And the ROI is there, but is it believable at the level of an individual study team, right? Because to them, they're just looking at the study budget. The way it tends to work in pharma is, you've got a protocol concept, and then you develop a protocol off of that. And there is an algorithm that somebody is working with that's going to spit out a budget for that team based on studies using these types of procedures and visit schedules, based on historical cost for study visits. This is your budget. this is what you have. Maybe we'll give you a bit of rounding around the edges, but that's the framework that you're kind of constrained around. Now, if you are doing right and including these decentralized elements in your protocol design, then hopefully it's in the budget up front. Because when you're using those algorithms and such, if you did not include using these decentralized approaches in your protocol design up front, now these are being looked at as additional line items. And so even though you can come back with ROI data and talk about return and value and overall value across the study, it's still a very hard sell. But probably even more important than that is the perceived cost on me as a study team lead, as a project manager, right? You're saying that there may be additional vendors and new stakeholders and new partners to engage. Who's going to onboard those and contract those and oversee those and support and communicate with those, right? Those are kind of perceived as well as adding indirect cost to me as a human, right? I want to go home at the end of the day. Now, we're not going to say those words. I'm not going to say, Gerald, the reason I'm not going to work with pharmacists in this trial is I want to have dinner with my kids after school, right? But that's what's on people's minds. And so, just as we're thinking about the evidence that's needed to show a return on using these approaches, we also have to think about the complexity of how these tools get introduced into our studies. How do we make it easier and bring less friction, both for study teams and pharma and the CROs, as well as for the teams at the research site, because that perceived friction is another source of, well, burden and cost.
You said a couple things in there that want to make off on tangents, and that I can't resist but to think about. You mentioned about the algorithms, and of course where we are with AI, and I know I definitely want to talk about that as a topic, the technology side of things, and the algorithms. And all I could think about is like you mentioned, it's success. It's planned for success and protocols, and I'm wondering where the algorithms are calculating in, right? The known things about, like, no, your study's not going to get recruited. No, no, your drug's not going to get approved. No, the reality of the end game of, right, not getting the recruited patients you need, not getting the data you need, and of course, then does the drug actually get approved? Because, like, we know those numbers hasn't changed. And I was thinking, as you said, the algorithms is like it'd be interesting to see if they're really plugging that in, and then, like you're saying, just put some of the pressure on to say pressure test to say what else can we do, and and then again, like you mentioned, is like what can we do about the recruitment, and then so you introduce these new line items with DCTs, and I can see it's like there's a catch-22 there about how you're going to proceed.
Well, there is, right? And some of it, is a problem of incentives that we've created ourselves. When we go to CROs and ask them about the feasibility of what we're suggesting, if we go to three CROs as partners and one of them says, this thing isn't going to enroll, it's going to cost 20% more, and another CRO says, I can enroll that, we've created this perverse incentive, right? Where we're rewarding the one that maybe is being a little overzealous and overambitious. Some would say the same is true for research sites. If there are two research sites that we're engaging in the trial, and one says, yeah, I can enroll this on budget, and the other maybe is being a little more grounded based on history, based on, having done studies like these and shares some of those challenges, we kind of flow with the incentive of rewarding those that maybe are a bit more ambitious. But we can talk about how some are starting to simulate trials, how some are starting to do that both synthetically. How can I create a digital twin of my protocol and run it 1,000 times, 10,000 times? It's not even really a digital twin of the protocol, it's infinite twins of or replicants of that trial to be able to run it in different environments, but then also do some real world simulations, bring that study protocol to a research site, and let's go through a visit and see what is this monster that we've created? Is it really doable, feasible? Have we created just too many barriers that we'll never actually find humans willing to participate?
That actually segues into another area that I want to talk about, and that's staffing. Because again, you can have great protocols. You say you go to the clinical site, And there's there's the dynamics of what's going on at clinical sites these days. And it's a kind of multi-pronged, and I'd really like to talk about like the DCTs and what they're doing and the evolution of DCTs compared to like what's going on at the current clinical sites. And really all I could think about is staffing, trying to get MDs to get involved in clinical trials when, like for myself, it's like 6 months before I go find, like, I moved and tried to find a doctor for myself, 6 months. It's like the healthcare professional shortage, um, pressuring, again, what's going on at the sites, but then, like you said, the staffing and think about like what's going with them. I want to go home at night, and
Yeah.
yet I don't have the patience I need for the recruitment. So let's just talk about, and again, I know there's several different things in there, but when
I
it
think
comes,
the dynamics of staffing at research sites have not normalized since the pandemic. And so during the pandemic, when we saw a lot of the drug development portfolio kind of slow and get put on pause while other vaccines and other anti-infectives were getting prioritized, it really messed with the staffing models in many of our research sites. And so there were a lot of concerns. There was the call to save our sites, right? That our sites were struggling during that period, and how do they retain and keep staff? And now fast forward, there are challenges with finding adequate staffing at many of our research sites today. The workhorse, the sort of bread and butter, the core resource that we rely on is often a study coordinator, and that's a very volatile position. For many, it could be a career path. For many, it's just a stepping stone to trying to move into some other role. And so, are we creating career development opportunities for folks to land and become really expert in supporting research studies as a coordinator, or are we just creating this constant churn where we are trying to constantly find people to play that role and always have our sites one step behind? Now, decentralized elements in a trial should or could provide some relief. If we could take low acuity procedures and say we will perform them in alternate ways so that the staff at the research site that is already saturated and busy can focus on the high acuity tasks. And for the economics of a site, those should be tasks for which they can bill higher, right? So let's take maybe the less revenue generating, low acuity tasks. Could we have that done remote or with a visiting nurse or using technology, and have the patient come in when it really matters, when there's more procedures or other activities that are required? Now, some sites I think would say, yes, thank you, but many sites say, I don't want to lose any of that revenue, right? I kind of need it all. And so look at some of those procedures moving elsewhere as a threat. In other cases, there's a sense of accountability and control that needs to be managed. Even though the data may be collected by a visiting nurse somewhere else, there's still the responsibility for oversight that lands on the investigator at the research site. So it may not be his or her nurse that's going into the patient's home, but what they do and the data that's collected still is the responsibility of that investigator. And so when sponsors are planning and budgeting, you don't just get the elegance of saying, I'm taking this line item, taking it away from you, site, and giving it to this other party. They have to make sure that there's still budget for the site, for their staff, for their investigator to perform the oversight that they're responsible for in terms of GCP, good clinical practice, and other requirements and obligations, both legal and ethical. And so, they're it's not quite as elegant as just taking a procedure and having it done somewhere else, but it can be a nice strategy to relieve some burden, especially around the study coordinator role. We have to make sure we're retaining capacity and resource, dollars and time for those investigators for the oversight that they're still responsible for.
I'm going to kind of put you on the spot, knowing how like the virtual trial started with you, DCT continue with you, but obviously you're a proponent to say yes, that should and could and should happen, right? And DCTs, proponent of saying yes, let's go to DCTs.
I think including options for patients is the right
Yeah.
future for
Yeah.
us. And when I describe that, there are many patients that cherish going to a research site. It's high touch. They get more attention from an investigator than they might get from their uh, provider in a routine care interaction. Um, they may have concerns that they want to be able to discuss and feel better doing that in person. For people that have the capacity to get to a site and that's a preference, we should never be taking that away. The desired end state is to create more options and more flexibility for how and where we engage. I feel the same about restaurants. I like going to a restaurant, but there are sometimes I just want to open an app and have that food delivered. I want that flexibility and choice. And there are some meals I know I just can't get delivered to my house. If I do, it'll just be a disaster, right? I know for this hibachi meal, I have to go to a proper restaurant to have that administered and prepared and served. But there are plenty of other procedures that I can have administered in my home. And the same is true when we're thinking about decentralized and what should be our North Star, our holy grail. It's not to shut down research sites across the country and do it all using bots, machines, and cameras. It's to create more paths that we as humans can say, yes, I can participate in the study. I can make it work with my life, my job, my family, my other responsibilities.
So that's like you've already like you pointed like the patient, right? We all almost everybody that's in clinical trials talks about patient, right? Patient centricity, patient first, looking at the patient. So I want to put that on hold for a minute. And let's go back to kind of where we were talking about the clinical site and their staffing. And, we know that there's just a ton of work going on at the sites and stress, et cetera, because I've seen many articles, you go to SCRS and, they talk about the stress and, et cetera. But I want to take that even further and talk about a little bit on the regulation side of it. We know that very interesting statement was made in the 2024 DCT um, guidance document about HCPs. Would you address that? And it's kind of like, is it a chicken and the egg? Did they say to do DCTs and the HCPs? Or was the FDA saying, listen, we don't have enough doctors and nurses to be able to deliver clinical trials. Let's try opening this up. So shed
So
some
when
light on
the
this for us, please. Because it was a
so
critical, like in the, I know that seems to be like one of the most cited topics when you look at the guidance document.
You're absolutely right. In fact, Gerald, when the document you're referring to is the FDA's now final guidance on the use of decentralized elements in randomized clinical trials. And before that was a final guidance, it was a draft guidance. And the greatest volume of submitted comments that the FDA received to that draft was around this section, where they introduced this concept of a role for HCPs, healthcare providers, to participate in randomized trials without being an investigator, without being a sub-investigator. And this was very not new to see it in writing from FDA. Um, it's interesting for many of us when I think of, well, who are these HCPs? It's the people that we know. It's my doctor, it's my pharmacist, it's the people that I interact with for my healthcare every day. But most of them are not going to be investigators in a clinical trial. In fact, it would be nonsensical for us to imagine that every healthcare provider has to be an investigator in every trial for me to have fair and equitable access to learn about a trial and to be able to participate. And what the FDA did with this language was open this pathway, open this concept that healthcare providers who are already trained and qualified to perform certain types of procedures as a part of how they provide routine care. Well, if your study protocol involves a procedure like that, then that healthcare provider can perform that procedure that happens to be described in the study protocol. So, put in other words, if your study protocol has a visit where there's just routine physiologic data being collected, height, weight, other data such as that, and a local provider in the community is considered qualified to provide that type of evaluation as a part of providing their healthcare, well, they could provide and collect that data in the context of a clinical trial without us putting them on forms and paperwork that define them as being an investigator or sub-investigator. And those forms we call an FDA 1572. And once you're documented on that form as being an investigator or sub-investigator, all of a sudden you're a place where FDA inspections may start to take place. And there's all sorts of other accountability and responsibility that flows. And so opening this door, it was very provocative. In fact, there were a number of leaders in the oncology center at FDA that indicated that they were some of the catalysts for that language. To them, they looked at how, for most patients in our country, about half may go to a large academic cancer center and about half obtain care in the community from community-based oncologists. But our clinical trials are all happening at the first half, those big cancer centers, but half of our patients are getting care in the community and are being denied access to those research opportunities. So what would happen in cancer trials if those routine care procedures, maybe a routine CAT scan, or maybe it's the administration of routine care chemotherapy? What if those could happen in the community setting without those providers having to become investigators and sub-investigators? Now, on the same day that the FDA dropped their final guidance document on decentralized elements in trials, they also dropped a draft guidance document that went a click further, specifically themed on routine care procedures at healthcare provider locations in the context of randomized clinical trials. And I have to say, it was a very provocative draft because it went maybe a click further than where I had even envisioned. And I think I try to be optimistic and progressive in how I read these. But in that additional draft they dropped, they described things like biopsies or other things that may be quite interventional. But again, if it's a provider who is doing that every day in the context of routine care, how might they be able to provide that service in the context of a trial? Now, at DTRA, we've started to do, and DTRA, as was mentioned at the outset, this is a nonprofit organization, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance. We are focused on supporting the adoption of these methods. We're a public-private partner with FDA. We started doing some primary research, doing both qualitative and quantitative insight generation with physicians and nurses and different specialties. Because what we found is many of us in the research community, we're talking to other people in the research community saying, well, this sounds interesting. But since it's all about engaging HCPs who aren't involved in research, what do they think? Do they think this is a good idea? What would be their concerns or hesitations? And so it's been a really interesting journey for us to start to learn where there may be some reservation among, when we started a segment, those who said, yeah, I'm interested, those who said, maybe I'm interested, and those who said, no, I'm not gonna touch this. And there are some differences and some nuances. How do we make it fit in their workflow? How do we make sure they're getting paid in ways that are legal and compliant? How do we make sure that there aren't additional legal or other types of liability or exposures that they may feel may impact their practice? Because some of these procedures may be considered not only a routine care procedure, but already on the reimbursement schedule, right? That CAT scan is still on the schedule for when coverage might warrant reimbursement for that CAT scan? Or is that CAT scan something that's outside of the traditional schedule of reimbursement, and so they're going to get paid through other channels for it to be conducted? How do we kind of manage that in ways that don't subject them to the fear or risk of being seen by OIG, the Office of the Inspector General at CMS, as somehow tripping over Medicare or Medicaid fraud concerns by double billing inadvertently? So these are very real and addressable concerns for us to be able to unlock this new pathway.
Yeah, it just, as you dive into that, the complexity is there for sure. But like anything, first things first, you take a step and you start unraveling and say, okay, let's just not say no. Let's move down that path.
Gerald, the reason I am so bullish on this topic, so you mentioned, did early decentralized trials. When I was at Pfizer, I was the head of clinical innovation, and some 20 years ago now, we designed and led the industry's first fully decentralized trial under an FDA IND. And when we were getting that off the ground, I'll never forget this hallway conversation. A gentleman named Michael, he was the head of commercial development at Pfizer, stopped me in the hallways. Now, this title, commercial development, what that meant is people who are thinking about the commercialization of the molecule, even though it's still in development. How do we start to plan for this molecule, even though it may just be a phase 2 or phase 3 asset at that time? He stopped me in the hallway and he said, this remote trial thing you're doing, if it works, it's going to unlock a whole new way for us to engage treating physicians in the community. He saw that. That wasn't like our intended plan for this. I didn't see it. He did, and sort of painted that picture. It took, 20 years, but he was right. Because, and this gets back to something I teased at the outset about recruitment and there being this freakonomics issue, these misaligned incentives. Why would your doc in the community talk to you about a clinical trial if participating in that trial means that he or she is going to refer you to a different provider at a different center across town, across the city, across the state, and fear leakage, losing revenue, losing that patient? Well, I think that's a very real concern for many providers. But what happens if now that provider doesn't have to be an investigator in the trial, but they can keep you in their practice? Those routine care procedures, you're still coming to his or her office for those to take place, and they are still billing and generating revenue and still, seeing you and helping to manage your overall care and wellness. I think that's a game-changing element in terms of fixing this misaligned incentive, because now that local doc, it almost doesn't matter if this is a Merck trial happening at health system over there or a Pfizer trial happening at a clinic across town. It almost doesn't matter as long as they can keep you in their house for those routine care procedures. They can be comfortable informing you about those trials happening elsewhere. And we know because of EMRs and decision support tools, there are ways that we can help doctors to better understand if their trials may match for a trial. Our problem has been this last mile of why would they care if it means that they're going to risk losing the patient. And this HCP language, well, it may be the first thing we've seen as a tool in our quiver to fix that.
So, of course, a slice of that is one of the main reasons for this conversation was, again, for the pharmacists that are on the call, is that for me, I grew up in the industry, always looking, and as a pharmacist, now granted, I work in the industry, but there wasn't a chief pharmacy officer in the industry. There wasn't, chief pharmacy operations. It was clinical operations. And it's like, but the moment it gets approved, there's a doctor pharmacist patient relationship. Doctors don't dispense anymore out of their offices. It doesn't occur. Why? For many reasons. But the idea is like, wait a minute, let's start thinking about bringing the pharmacist in, because the moment it gets approved, pharmacists are approached immediately on the new drugs, et cetera. And then we got thinking again, what again is another HCP provider. To me, when we talk about adherence and retention and recruitment stuff, this is a huge piece that the pharmacist plays in the community that doesn't exist in clinical trials today.
Well, look, most patients that we're looking to enroll in a clinical trial, they have existing providers in their life because they already have a diagnosis. And in most cases, they're already on an existing treatment option. Yeah, there are certainly some instances where a patient may lack any other option. But in most cases, they are walking out with a prescription, even if it's not ideal, even if it's prednisone instead of something that's targeted and specific for them. But that we're kind of this dynamic exists in this patient's life. They have an existing provider, they have an existing pharmacist, and we're hoping that with a clinical trial, we can yank them out of that triad and drop them into completely different relationships. And I think that's why when we talk about why does recruitment still suffer and struggle, it's in part because we've been trying to build like a parallel universe, this bizarro, alternate universe where, you're no longer a patient, you're a subject, and you're no longer interacting with an EHR, you're interacting with electronic data capture systems, and it's no longer a drug, it's an investigational product, and everybody's roles and titles and systems change. And what happens if we can make that, well, less friction, and enable your existing care infrastructure, the people you already know and trust, to be able to engage with you about this research opportunity and stay a part of it with you during that journey. Yes, some other stakeholders may start to come in, a principal investigator that maybe you didn't know before, but that's okay because the people you know and trust are still there with you.
Yeah, that's as we talk about that and looking at the time, I do want to move to the patient, right? And the idea of like what we're finding in our current role as pharmacists, playing a role in trying to recruit patients to clinical trials, and we'll talk about, we probably won't get the drug supplies, but the role pharmacists can play. But I want to talk about the patient in particular. And the one thing that we've been finding is the aware patient, the clinical, like, and you've got professional patients and all that, but so to me, the aware patient and the unaware or the naive patient. And of course, what we're finding is in working with all the pharmacists that we work with in the community pharmacies, it's almost all community naive or clinical trial naive patients. And so when I think about now, we have to establish the 5 touch points with them before they're finally going to say, "Oh yes." But it's been quite a ride. So let's talk about about uh, the aware patient and the not aware patient. And I have a little bit of a problem with one of the articles and just again reading between the lines that was put out like by Tufts, and they talk to patients about like where do you want to see, or how do you want to do this, and it's like, well, time out. Those patients are all involved in a clinical trial. They already know, they've already gone through the 5 touch points and the ups and downs. It's like, let's go to the patients that are not in the clinical trial and start asking, and that's some of the things that we've been looking at. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about like what are your thoughts about this.
I think that like any 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 stakeholder who's involved in, say, commercialization of a product knows, there's a certain state of readiness, and for any buyer or decision point for say a consumer, and I think that's very true here as well. And there's I think about this as sort of this continuum of research readiness, right? And somebody does reach this inflection point where they're now ready to actively consider a trial and feel like they're in a position to be able to say yes. And as you're saying before, then there's this curve that they have to be able to ascend, and everybody ascends it at a different pace. And there are, but the milestones along the way aren't that different. And what people need, though, to move along this continuum are different. And so it is an opportunity for me in this age of AI to think about how do we start to better deploy tools that can help me understand where a patient is in that journey of readiness, and then give them the tools and information that is both culturally and language-wise appropriate for them, for their learning level that they may be at, not just in terms of health literacy, but literacy in general, but is able to meet them and give them information that can be trusted and help them to move along that continuum. Now, for some people, that process may be years. But for others, it may actually be a process of days or weeks, as long as we're meeting them, understanding where they are, and helping them on their own kind of journey of research readiness. I think today we kind of blanket everybody with kind of the same story and the
Yeah.
same messaging, despite everybody kind of coming in at a different place. And we do that because it's easier. But and the idea of giving AI tools that are engaging with patients in different ways seems kind of daunting. It seems a little scary. How do I trust this? And how will it really understand patients well enough to give them information that is compliant and appropriate and ethically and clinically appropriate? But honestly, how do we not in today's day and age? Because most people are now turning to their chat GPTs instead of Dr. Google to get this type of information.
Boy, that's I love the talk. We could just talk about the future where that might be able to go because it is, the things we're finding out about in your community. We always talk about, we go to the community pharmacist because they exist in the community because they are the community. They wouldn't exist if they didn't know how to communicate with their community, with their patients.
Right.
And
And
everyone of
you
them's
go to a
different.
pharmacist in Harlem, or you go to a pharmacist in Chinatown, or you go to a pharmacist in the suburbs or in the country, and the stores look different, the language looks different, the conversations are different because they understand their community in that type of way that AI can only try to copy and emulate.
So I wanted to still, so, I mean, looking at the time because talking about, and then of course the patient that does you work, then like you said, right now the model, right, in the current model, they go to the clinical site that they don't know anybody, the doctor they don't know, staff they don't know, versus again this DCT model is like how much can we keep them like at the pharmacy? How much can we keep them local to local healthcare provider, such that they can come complain to somebody or talk to somebody that they know when something isn't happening or they don't understand or even just traveling or getting into the clinic.
Well, it's a great point, right? So for most patients who participate in clinical trials, they are not fortunate to have the serendipity that their existing doctor happens to be an investigator in a trial that happens to be right for them. It's great when that math adds up. In most cases, it just doesn't. And so those patients are going to an unfamiliar clinic, an unfamiliar academic medical center, or in some cases, an unfamiliar freestanding research site, a clinical setting that is only providing support for research studies and not providing care. But whichever of those cases, it's now this whole new environment for them. When they go back to their doctor or back to their pharmacist with concerns, I think it would only be natural for that doctor or pharmacist in their life to wonder, why are you doing that? I don't know anything about this study that you're participating in, right? Like, why don't you stick with our triad that
Yeah.
where we began, versus kind of deviating on this alternate course? And so by not engaging this triad that already exists with a doctor or the physician, the pharmacist, and the patient, I think we're kind of setting up that patient for failure. Because now when they go back to their existing trusted providers with questions or concerns, those providers aren't empowered to be able to help them.
Listen, looking at time, I want to remind everybody that please, if you have questions, put it in the chat. And Teresa will be monitoring. If there's questions, we'll answer in real time or again towards the end. But otherwise, we're just going to keep talking. But and there's one point that recently you sat down and talked about AI with Microsoft, and I want to touch on that, and then I'll ask you if there's things we're missing that you want to talk about. But in particular, you want to just talk about that conversation, and you mentioned about AI. And I got pretty excited when you start thinking about, like, if we do talk to the pharmacist and learn, how do we talk to the patient all differently, all uniquely? Because then maybe we get past two touch points with one touch point.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
where
how
my
can
mind
we
went
kind of
right away.
accelerate some of that, right? And I think that, the like somebody simplified AI in my life this way. They said, look, think about AI as two things. It's really good at looking laterally to find information, and then it's really good at going deep around that information to either automate or perform some sort of task. That's all it's doing. It's not creating, it's just sort of using information that was already available and then can go deep around that and help to automate something. And, even though that seems maybe oversimplified, it does create a lot of interesting opportunities for us to personalize how we engage with people, to better understand where they are on that journey. As we think about the clinical research enterprise, there are there's really no shortage of places and spaces where AI either can or already is impacting how we're planning and designing studies, how we're authoring studies, how we're collecting data and can streamline some of that data collection or normalize it or provide quality and oversight around that data or help to streamline how we prepare that data for regulators or others. But when we're thinking about these challenges around different stakeholders, pharmacist, healthcare provider, and patient, I do think there are some really interesting opportunities for us to help keep people better informed about the progress of the trial, help understand where people are in their learning journey.
From that discussion you had, what was a key takeaway? Like when, and I only again referenced because I knew I was going to be talking to you. It's like, oh wow, I wish I would have saw that.
A lot of that conversation was around organizational readiness and what are some of the different organizational impacts of AI, whether you're a clinic, whether you're a CRO, whether you're a pharmaceutical company, and thinking about, almost this role of what we've referred to as agents with agentic AI, where you could almost start to envision digital workers and what might that start to look like as we think about our data management or monitoring organizations. Because, like on the one extreme, some of us may jump and say, that's the end, right? All these people are going to be out of work. We're going to have little bots scurrying about. And others say, maybe it could be a job aid, but it's probably not going to be that helpful to me in my day to day. And like most things, the truth is going to land somewhere in the middle. But for it to get there, what's the state of maturity and readiness for our people and our organizations, whether at research sites, at our partner organizations, or in our own companies? And how do we select and deploy the right tools to support our people, to be able to use these tools to be more effective and efficient with their time? In most cases, when we see these tools being used, it's not like all of a sudden our workforce are taking 4-hour lunches. Turns out there was plenty of other work to get done. It's just, we're able to get through it. In some cases, for some of our roles, just a lot better and a lot more efficiently.
Thank you. In looking at the time, is there a topic that you want to discuss? Because again, I've kind of like I caught you. Like I know we briefly discussed it, but I hit
Some folks will ask me, did DCT peak in the pandemic? Is there still life and legs for this category coming out of the pandemic?
I purposely didn't ask you that.
It's fair. I think it's a
Yeah.
very fair question because, look, you mentioned hype cycles before, and for those that aren't familiar, there's a consulting group, Gartner, that puts out these hype cycles, and they'll describe almost any innovation or any category with this journey of initially there's sort of this peak of inflated expectations that a new innovation goes through before it enters this trough of disillusionment. And then, it slowly ascends to reach its actual potential. And in most cases, especially in the pharmaceutical industry and clinical research, that cycle takes years. But in the case with DCT, decentralized tools, during the pandemic, it was a very compressed cycle because these types of elements weren't being used in most studies, but then got aggressively adopted as a countermeasure because of the environment we were operating in. How do I keep ensuring drug supply for patient? How do I keep monitoring and collecting data from those patients? How do I ensure proper oversight for those patients for their safety? And so we saw this aggressive adoption curve. It wasn't a smart and thoughtful adoption curve. It wasn't a strategy that people thought about the implications for their organization and their workforce and making it sustainable. So it isn't surprising to many that as the pandemic receded, so did a lot of that adoption because it wasn't done in a way that made sense for a go-forward organization. What the pandemic did do was help us to realize that we can use these tools and methods. It didn't show us how to use them in ways that could scale and be sustainable, but we knew we could use them. In fact, we published a paper with the FDA showing that For oncology submissions that took place based on data collected during the pandemic, the overwhelming majority included decentralized methods, and it was not a barrier in terms of quality or oversight for those submissions. So we can use them, we can be inspected, we can perform submissions of data, and they can get through just as they always did. But there has been this kind of pullback in the industry because, again, the how, the way wasn't the right way. It was done quickly and with urgency, not surprising. And so I think the question for many is, can DCT make its kind of comeback from that peak of adoption? And I think especially in this economic environment where we see so many pharmaceutical companies over the last 2 years that have pruned their pipelines and cut headcount just because of the economic conditions they're operating in. We're all seeing inflation, but they're also seeing challenges around what reimbursement will look like for their molecules going forward. But DTRA has never lost a pharmaceutical company as a member, and we add 2 new pharma companies every year. And so what this tells me is that even in this climate, there continues to be this commitment among the pharma companies to make these elements work. And we're seeing that in some of the initiatives internally that many of those companies are doing. On the flip side, we lose a CRO as a member every year at DTRA because they'll tell us we just can't sell this stuff. People aren't buying DCT. So why is there this interesting mismatch where vendors will tell me I can't sell DCT, but sponsors will say we're deploying and we're committed. And so there is this very interesting discordance that we see in the market. So it's very easy to run into a conference and see half the room say DCT is dead and the others say long live DCT. I think that the market hasn't optimized yet on what the buyers appreciate that they need to buy here. And that creates opportunity as well for organizations that are innovators and pursuing these new models, such as pharmacy. I think that it says that there are opportunities among the buyers, the sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies that remain committed here. It's just a lot of the large incumbents haven't really figured it out yet.
So I'm in your boat. I think we're on the Enlightenment, and I think it's a matter of it's here to stay. Like dead in the concept like that, because we are addressing equality, we are addressing the regulations, we are bringing pharmacists into this model, and when I think about again day by day the issues that we have, like we talked about with healthcare providers, the staffing requirements, and more importantly, what does the patient want? To enroll the
There you
studies.
go, Gerald. That's
Yeah.
it, right? Because one thing you'll hear consistently across companies today, pharma companies, biotechs, pharma or otherwise, all of them are listening to patients when they're planning and designing their studies. That is now a normalized part of the process of how to develop a protocol. And when you're actually listening to patients, you cannot you cannot avoid hearing about the burden and the challenge of access. Now, it's up to the companies to realize that there's actions they can take around that versus just being empathetic and realizing, well, we're going to be burdening people. And if they truly want to embody the rhetoric of we're patients first, we're patient centric, they can. It's just an action, it's a decision that one has to make.
And I think innovative companies, I think like to think like RxE2, AI, other things are all going to find ways to make it more cost effective, and delivering with better outcomes, indirect outcomes, right? Retention, right? Better recruitment, better retention, better adherence, et cetera. Well, listen, this has been tremendous, and I've always liked sitting down with you, and I really appreciate you joining us, and hopefully the pharmacist today learned a little bit more about clinical trials, and more importantly, even like myself, I learned today a few things, considering I spent quite a bit of time listening to DCTs and stuff and following what DCTRA is doing.
Well,
So
thanks for, continuing to wave the flag as you did as an early pioneer and a sustaining force for the role of the pharmacist to be able to have a seat at this table and be able to participate and impact how patients are able to engage in clinical research. And I'll end by saying, I'm glad I got the memo that today is blue on black. Like I'm looking in a mirror, Gerald.
Teresa's very good.
Oh, no, this was
Wonderful.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, both of you and everybody on board here. And please follow up with me, email me if you have any other questions after this conversation. We would love to address any of your questions. So, with that being said, I will let everybody go and get on with their day. And thanks again so much, Craig. We appreciate